What is up, sports fans? My name is Jake Nizuski. You can call me Jake Iggy or Iggy for short. And this is Iggy's Sports Talk. So I really appreciate everybody tuning in to another episode of Iggy's Sports Talk. And today, I have a very special guest on the show today. His name is Dell Leonard Jones, and he is an author of a historical fiction novel called At the Bat, the Strikeout that shamed America. And it's currently ranked number 10 on Goodreads' list of 112 greatest baseball novels of all time. So how's it going, Dell?
Good. Thank you.
Absolutely. How's your 2021 going so far?
About the same as 2020 so far. Still waiting for that vaccine to kick in somewhere. It's out there in the ether somewhere, I think.
Exactly. What did you do during the quarantine time and the downtime of 2020?
Oh, gee. For one thing, my car battery went dead for
Jeez.
about 2 months, and I didn't even miss it. And actually, my wife and I actually started 2020 on a cruise in Antarctica.
Wow.
And we were told we were one of the few people that had ever been to Antarctica when we were on the cruise. And I think that was the last cruise ship that went there before everything shut down. We
Wow.
got off in January, and then right after that, everything shut down. So we were either the last ones to be to Antarctica or close to the last ones. I'm sure there's still like scientists that are stranded up there and
Right.
and not getting coronavirus, but I don't think tourists are up there anymore or down
Still,
there.
who knows when we're going to be able to even go on cruises again, or even if cruises will be a thing. Let's say after this whole thing is done.
Yeah. They already had their problems even before coronavirus. There was always something going on with those things. So I don't know. You jam a bunch of people in. Uh, my theory was that they should have used the cruise ships right from the start to get herd immunity with young people who wouldn't care if they got the coronavirus. They'd put
Right.
them on a cruise ship, pack 3,000 of them on a cruise ship for like 3 weeks until everybody got it and everybody got over it, and then they could let them all out and they'd all be immune. And if they did that with all the cruise ships, I think we could have reached herd immunity that way.
I wouldn't be surprised. That's definitely a good idea. I mean, especially for like myself, I had some friends who actually like right before March, they went on a cruise ship. And I remember when they came back, I said to them, because we were going back up to college, I'm like, I don't know how comfortable I am with being in the same like house as you guys. And they were like, what are you talking about? You have no idea what you're talking about. I'm like, while you were gone, this coronavirus thing really blew up. And then the next week later, our semester was put online. And that's when they were like, wow, this thing is actually for real.
And this is real, yeah. Yeah.
But what did you other than just trying to get through it? Did you pick up any hobbies? Did you clean a lot of stuff around your house? Did you get a lot of stuff done?
Well, I decided I was going to learn how to do my, no, I have two novels and I was going to put them on audiobook. So I got on and learned how to use the Audible software, which is amazing. I don't know if you've had any work with that with all your audio
Yeah.
thing, but it's like free software. And it wasn't that, even for someone as old as I am, it wasn't that hard to learn. I got me this Yeti microphone, plugged it into a laptop, and recorded my novels on audiobook, and that was a lot of fun. I felt like I was back as a kid, like play acting, doing my little play, just reading my novel and doing voices and stuff like that. I have no idea. I'm sure it's like far from actor like professional, but with the software, all you have to do if you like stumble on a word or something, you
Right.
just go back, you hit like Control D, and it takes you back like 5 seconds, and you're hearing what you recorded, and then all of a sudden you just like roll right into what you were doing. It's pretty amazing. So you can stumble all day long, and I was in no hurry, so I could just
Right.
like fix everything that way.
That's easy enough. That's cool that you're able to go back, change it, and make it how you want it to. Because I listened to a little bit of your audiobook, and I compared to other audiobooks, some people just sit down in front of their book, just read it, and it's very monologue-ish, and it's very monotone-ish, excuse me. And you put a lot of personality with it, and so I was curious, how long did it really take you to be able to record the audiobook to what you wanted it to be?
Oh, probably. I would do maybe a chapter a day. There's like 20 some chapters. So it's probably about a month worth of recording, which I think that's a lot longer than the professional actors take to record a book.
Hmm.
But I was in no hurry and I re-recorded. I would like record a paragraph and listen to it and either move on, think it was okay, or just go ahead and re-record the paragraph. If I was like making a living at it, like the actors are, I wouldn't be able to afford to do that. But I just went back and re-recorded and just had fun doing it.
That's awesome. It must have helped definitely the quarantine time go by much quicker than you really expected it to.
Yeah, yeah, and it was fun getting my sound booth closet all fixed up and everything.
That's awesome.
I thought of doing it in there, but the light's not very good. I don't know if I'm in my dining room now, so it may be kind of echoey. But it's kind of nice to have a closet where you don't get the echo effect. And they recommend that with the audiobooks. Got a
Yeah, it definitely makes
real
sense.
dead sound.
Right. And so I was curious. So your book at the bat, excuse me, the strikeout that shamed America. I want to first start off with when did you first fall in love with the game of baseball?
Oh, gee. Uh, I've been in love with it my whole life. I was actually, I go back far enough to where I remember Willie Mays. He was kind of my hero. My parents grew up in the Bay Area, so I was a San Francisco Giants fan, Willie Mays, Willie McCovey. And then I played Little League, but that was back when they didn't have video recorders, but I was lucky, and my father, I think I was lucky enough. My father had an old fashioned, like just movie camera that he'd got from my grandmother, and the film and the developing of the film was like really expensive. So what he would do when I was up at bat in the Little League, he would wait for the pitcher to be just about to deliver the ball. He'd turn on the camera, and then I would swing and miss. And then he would turn off the camera because I didn't get a hit. He probably would have left it running if I hit the ball. So I've got this video of me like swinging like 100 times a minute because he recorded every one of my swings and misses. So
It's funny.
that probably describes my career in baseball. I've always been a fan. Was never very good at it. Started playing slow pitch. That's more my speed. I could actually make contact in slow pitch softball. So that's what I moved on to when I was older.
I tried out slow pitch softball. Actually, it was one of my college like intramural sports, and I played baseball all throughout growing up, all until high school. And then when I got to college, I wanted to focus on my academics. But it's interesting because I had such a hard time with being able to time up when the pitch was coming. And so most of the time I would roll over to the third baseman or go to the shortstop, and I would just always pull the hell out of the baseball because the speed difference is insane.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's nothing worse than somebody that's used to a fast pitch coming into slow pitch. In fact, my daughter played. She was pretty good at fast pitch softball. She got a scholarship at South Carolina to play, and it was always when you got to like high level fast pitch softball, it was always good to have like a pitcher that could throw strikes but really slow strikes, because the players, they would get used to the speed, and when they started crushing like the really good fast pitcher, you'd bring in this slow pitcher that could throw it over the plate.
Mm-hmm.
And for at least an inning or two before they could catch up to her, they would just be tearing their hair out, because these things would just like, they knew it was coming. It was like change ups, and they knew the change up was coming every pitch, but it took them a while to actually get used to it.
That was me as a pitcher. I all throughout little league and all throughout like middle school and like that sort of stuff. Kids would come in, throw like 70 miles per hour. I was a second baseman, so that kind of tells you how my arm strength really is. And so I would go in there, throw 55, 60 miles per hour, and it's funny that you brought up the changeup. I would have this changeup that would go from 60 miles per hour to my fastball, and would go down to like I would throw it as slow as I could just to get over the plate, because I knew it would tie people up. I knew I would get the batters all upset. But obviously after that one full inning that I got a 1-2-3, batters started to wait back on it, and I would be swinging my head around real fast.
Yeah, and that's when you bring back in the fast pitcher, when they start catching up to the slow pitcher, then you bring the fast one back in. Yeah.
Exactly. So you brought up the San Francisco Giants, and I also read as well that you're a Washington Nationals fan as well, right?
Yeah, I got the San Francisco Giants from my parents. They grew up in the Bay Area, and then I've been in the Washington D.C. area since 1992. I came out here to work, so I was here when they reestablished the Washington Nationals, and I've been a pretty big fan of theirs, and really loved the World Series, not the pandemic World Series, but the World Series before that, when it went 7 games and nobody won a home game. That was just an amazing World Series to me. That the Nationals won in 7 games, and they won all 4 on the road.
Right. Yeah, it must have been tough, especially for you, because you said that you've been there since '92. So, like seeing the progression, at least to the team, where they had to get that number one pick and then get another number one pick, but like it must have been exciting as a fan in being within, the state, to see guys like Strasburg, Bryce Harper, who's actually my favorite player in the MLB, going to Washington and really bring that excitement.
Yeah, it really was, and they were always pretty good. In fact, I think they had a better team a year or two before the one they won the World Series. I think they were the wild card team the year they won the World Series, and like the year before they won the division, and they were, maybe the Los Angeles Dodgers were as good as they were, but nobody else was. And then I think they lost in the first round, so they actually had a better team that year. I think that was Bryce Harper's last year here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was funny, even as a big Bryce Harper fan, to see them, the posts on social media jabbing at him about, the Nationals win a World Series, obviously when their best player leaves,
Right.
but I think it's incredible what they were able to do during that year with. I forget what the percentage was, but I think it was like 13% after the All-Star break that they were supposed to like make the playoffs, and then they switch it all around. I remember just like watching that as a diehard baseball fan. I was ecstatic for Washington, just since it was their first one.
Yeah, I even bailed on them, which is kind of like I guess I'm a fair weather fan, because it's kind of like I figured they were out of it and didn't even pay attention to them for a few weeks. Then all of a sudden I look at the standings, and they're not close to first place in the division, but I realized, wow, they have a good shot at making the playoffs. Is like, what happened? I went to sleep for 3 weeks, and all of a sudden they're in it.
Exactly. I'm a big Red Sox fan, as you can see behind me. So this past year, I was watching those standings every single game, hoping and praying that there would be something that would go well for them this past year to help them make the playoffs. But no, obviously that didn't work out.
Yeah, you got to ignore them. Yeah,
exactly.
That worked for me.
There you go. But I was curious. So you started as a sports writer, and then you became a business reporter for USA Today, and mainly wrote in the money section for 18 years. And I was curious. So what is sort of like a normal day reporting in the money section for USA Today? Do you look at a lot of numbers, a lot of finances?
Yeah, I had for the most time I was in the money section, I had what they called the corporate leadership beat. And it was actually established. I was the first reporter on that beat, because USA Today, they were like, the surveys and stuff, the marketing surveys and stuff showed that readers really liked USA Today, but it wasn't being read by top executives, leaders of companies, especially in New York, where they all read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal,
Right.
But they weren't reading USA Today, the survey showed. And so they wanted to get these people to read USA Today, because those people had a lot of clout with advertising spending. My beat wasn't set up to like get advertising, but to get these people to read the paper so that they would make, more intelligent advertising decisions.
Right.
And so I took over the beat, and the challenge was to get them into the paper, to get them to read it, and yet write stories that were of interest to the general readership too. I didn't just want them to read it and everybody else be bored with it. So I started writing stories about CEOs that were spanked as children, and CEOs who cheated at golf, things that other people want to read about CEOs, but also the CEOs don't want to read about. Every one of them I interviewed about cheating at golf says, "Oh, I don't cheat at golf." And I says, "Well, have you ever played with a CEO who cheated at golf?" "Oh yeah, all the time I play with CEOs who cheated at golf." And so I was able to cobble together a story without anybody admitting that they did it, but everybody else did it.
That's interesting. That must have been cool to see, or just to like research those different kinds of stories because just from like the plain view regular news, I mean, you never really hear about these stories until really social media came about, where people were leaking things. We just saw like the whole blow up with Hollywood, Harvey Weinstein, like Bill Cosby. Nothing, none of that really would have came out if social media wasn't a factor. So do you think social media might have played a little bit differently if in your job 18 years ago?
Well, it pretty much destroyed the business model of newspapers.
Mhm.
For good or bad, newspapers are on a shoestring compared to what they used to be. I
Right.
don't know how much readers know, but if you're still reading a newspaper, it's being put out by a fraction of the people who used to put it out. And so
Mhm.
therefore, you kind of have to go to other sources for news. A lot of the good investigative reporting now is done by nonprofit foundations because they're the only ones that get enough contributions to hire a staff that you can put 3 reporters on a story for a length of time. Newspapers can no longer afford to do that. In fact, I don't know if you ever saw the Academy Award winning movie, The Spotlight. It was it
Unfortunately,
was
I haven't.
about Boston, and it was a great movie, great newspaper movie. But I was just sad watching it because when I watched it, I figured this is the last time newspapers will ever do this. It was about, they put like 3 or 4 reporters on for a year looking at child abuse by the Catholic Church, essentially,
Right.
and no longer can newspapers, even the big newspapers, maybe the New York Times, that may be in the best position, Wall Street Journal, to do something like that. But I just can't imagine a newspaper putting 4 reporters on one story for a year. It just wouldn't happen because they just can't afford to do it.
Right. Yeah. And then nowadays somebody would snatch it up, post it on social media, and bam, all that money, all that story, all the story revenue that could have come from it, gone.
Yeah, yeah.
That's interesting. I never really thought about it that way. And I'm curious. So after your 18 years with the USA Today, sort of what how were you able to find your interest in writing novels?
Well, I saw the writing on the wall for newspapers, and I was in good enough position to get out of it. And I'd always wanted to write a novel, and I decided, all the time I was reporting, every once in a while, I'd write a story, maybe something like the CEO golf cheating thing or something, and an agent would call me up on the phone and say, that might make a pretty good book. They were looking for nonfiction. And I always told them, it probably would, but I just don't have the attention span to spend a year on one thing. And so I never did it. But then when I was no longer, working every day, I still do a little freelancing, but I was no longer like putting in all the time. I decided I wanted to write a book, but I decided I was done with interviewing people. But I wanted to write about people. So I did historical novels where real people were in the book, but they were no longer alive. So I didn't have to do a single interview. I did like a
Mhm.
lot of historical research and that kind of thing, but I didn't have to interview a single person to do it. So I went back far enough. My first book was 1898, set in 1898. At the Bat is set in 1888, which is the year Casey at the Bat, the poem, was written. And so and I went back there, and the people I brought into the book, the real life people like Cap Anson, well, he's like one of the original first Hall of Fame players. I put in the book Moses Fleetwood Walker, who was the last African American player in the major leagues before Jackie Robinson, at least until a couple of weeks ago. Uh, and I put in Nellie Bly, who was an investigative reporter with the New York World, and I put in Mouse Matthews, who pitched at that time, so he kind of fit into it too. And I was just amazed. He's the winningest pitcher not in the Hall of Fame. And so, the poem doesn't say who was pitching to Casey at the time, but I
Mhm.
say who better than the winningest pitcher not in the Hall of Fame to be the one that struck out Casey. So I used him too. And they were all from this era. I mean, being in that one game, it's all make believe. but these players were all from that era, so I was able to put them all in.
That's interesting, and I think it's kind of cool how, you brought up how, you did have these other experiences or these other opportunities in your past, but it all was able to come together at some point. But I was wondering, so like during the process of writing a novel, you mentioned how you said initially that you didn't have the attention span to sit down for a year and write a novel. Was that process sort of a learning experience where you had to sort of have an open mind about sitting down and focusing on something for a year? And did you have to get used to that?
Yeah, although I kind of took it as a like a part-time job. I get up first thing in the morning and I would write until lunchtime. It'd be, a good solid 4 hours of writing, or before I started writing the research.
Hmm.
Then I would go and I would work out. I always worked out like right after lunch, which is people thought I was crazy because I work out on a full stomach. And that gave me a second morning, and either I could come back and work on the book or I could go do something else. So it's basically like a part-time job, but it's a part-time job that you have to do. I had to do every day. It's not like
Yeah.
something I could say, oh, I'm going to work today, I'm not going to work tomorrow. I made it a habit to put in those 4 hours every day. And then I also officiate sports, like mostly high school level sports. And so that filled like my late afternoons, early evenings a lot of the time. So I had a busy day. I had the part-time job of writing, go work out. A couple hours later, I was off to some kind of a game, a basketball game, fast pitch softball, field hockey. I officiate all three of those.
That's interesting. And did your experience as sort of an umpire officiating these games sort of influence you to want to write about more of a sports centric historical fiction book like at the BAP?
Yeah, and especially it gave me uh, a main character. I decided right at the start I was going to make my narrator of the Casey at the Bat book the umpire. Uh, there's a couple of chapters from Casey's point of view and from Nellie Bly's point of view, but the main character in the book is the umpire. And so because I never umpired at a high level, but I had enough experience to know what it feels like to get like harangued and harassed when everybody thinks you blew a call. And the worst part is like when you think you may have I mean, it can be so close and you kind of have second thoughts. Well, maybe I did blow that call. And at my level, I never had instant replay to go back and look at the TV to see if I did or did not, but it
Right.
would give you doubts. The best feeling I ever had was when it was a close play and I was certain I got the call right, but a coach who had a different angle or they had a bias, and the fans like on one side of the field. It's amazing what angles can do.
Hmm.
They would like really give me a hard time about the call, but I actually felt good when I knew I got the call right, but they didn't. Uh,
Right.
I basically said, all you people just kick that call is basically what I said in my head. Kicking a call is what in officiating, that's what they call like when you mess up,
Right.
which does happen, and you know it. That
Mhm.
all officials at all levels know that they mess up calls sometimes. That everybody's human.
I actually have had some experience with umpiring baseball games. I did a few
Oh,
little league games, and I remember it was little league games where like kids like 10 years old were playing, and I had the coaches like yelling at me from the third base side, and I'm volunteering for this. Like, what is going on right now?
yeah.
Like, and I'm like, I get it, but like, come on, these kids are like 10. And it was funny because I actually had an experience where I my friends were playing on both the opposing teams, and it was like all of my friends on these both teams, and I was the field umpire. And I remember there was like one call where the next day at school I got tons of crap. They're like, what are you talking about? I don't know how you saw that, like all this sort of stuff. And I'm just like, listen, I was just doing my job.
Yeah, and the younger they are, the more abuse you take as an umpire. Uh, Actually, in any sport, the lower level you do, the harder it is to officiate it. first the kids are like doing the crazy things that you really need to know the rules about. Like it's like in a little league where there'll be a situation where somebody will bat out of order, and when you get to higher level ball, that never happens. So those guys never really need to really know the rules as much as the people that you have to deal with it. All of a sudden you have somebody batting out of order. You need to know what the rule book says about what you do when somebody bats out of order.
Yeah.
So it's people that are umpiring or officiating the lower levels that actually have the hardest problems. And they're all also doing the craziest things. The higher level you do, you can kind of like anticipate, here comes a slide by, the throw's coming in, there's going to be a slide by. And so you kind of position yourself for that because you're doing a high level game. But at a low level, you never know what the kid's going to do. They're just, they may turn around, run backwards. You may get a passed runner, which is another rule. I was watching a major league game one time where there was a runner on first base and a deep fly hit to right field, and the runner had to kind of hold up to see if the ball was going to get caught, and so it wasn't, the ball dropped, but he wasn't that far. He was only like halfway to second. And in the meantime, the guy who hit the ball that deep was running, full speed. And he went right by the guy, the guy had to like start running again when the ball,
Right.
The guy that hit the ball ran by him. And the camera just happened to be right on the past runner and the umpire. And I could see the umpire's eyes just get big, like, oh, crud. Something has just happened, and you could just see his wheels turning, because this is probably something that at a major league level, it's probably something that maybe happens to one umpire once every 10 years or something. Right. Got the call right, but I was just laughing at the look on his face when he saw it, and he knew he had to call something, and the wheels were turning. So
I can only imagine what the runner who passed him in his head. Like, think about if he turned around and he's like, wait, no, you gotta go, you go. Like, that would look so like weird on TV, especially watching it. I feel like as a fan, I'd be like, what are you doing?
Yeah. And the rule is that the guy who did the passing, he's out.
It makes sense.
Automatically, but the ball is live, so you don't kill it or anything. But the umpire has to signal that the runner the batter in this case, is out. And now, but the other guy's still like free to run or free to be put out. It's still a live ball. So that's the rule, but this umpire had to make a quick decision, and he did. He was just a little bit delayed, but he did finally come and call the guy out that was supposed to be out and made the right call. So I was pretty impressed that he did it when it's probably something that has never happened to him. So I was pretty impressed that he got the call right, even though you could see he was like thinking about it really hard.
Yeah, exactly. That's crazy. I don't think I've ever heard or seen anything like that on a baseball field. But I read something where you only feared your personal safety when you were umpiring a church league game. I was curious what that story was about.
Yeah, that was actually a slow pitch game. I don't umpire slow pitch hardly ever. I may have done like 10 games in my life of slow pitch, but I was doing this church league slow pitch game, and it was so low level that the home plate, they had 2 plates so that nobody could ever get hurt at the plate. They would have like the plate where the batter stood, and they would have another plate off to the side where the runners would, if you were going to score, you would have to cross that plate. And it was treated like a first base call. Like if the runner crossed one plate, the catcher caught the ball on the other, and if the throw beat the runner, it was like a force out at first base, which really made a lot of people hold up at third base, because you could get thrown out a lot easier that way than you could if they actually had to tag you.
Right.
And so that I was just telling you that to show how low level this game was. And there was this one guy on the team that he'd been a little bit of a trouble, a little bit of a head case the whole game, and his team had been behind the whole game, and they were batting in the last inning. The bottom of the last inning, and they were making a comeback, and he came up with 2 outs and either 2 or 3 runners on base. I don't remember, but they were like the tying and winning runs that were on base, and he was up, and he came up and he like sticks his bat out and starts yelling at the opposing team, like just saying a bunch of crud at them. And by rule, you're not allowed to taunt the opposing team. Right. And I told him that. I says, don't taunt the opposing team. but he kept doing it. And I says, well, if you taunt them again, I'm going to have to eject you. And he did it again. And so I ejected him. And by rule, not only was he ejected, but because he was batting at the time, he's also out. And so
About that.
he
Wow.
was ejected. He was out. It was game over. That was a third out of the inning, game over. And he came after me, and his teammates had to restrain him.
Wow.
And so that's the only time I've taken a lot of verbal abuse, but that's the only time where I thought somebody was going to actually take a swing at me, because he was just nuts enough to do it.
Right. Wow, that's a triple whammy right there. You can't get any worse situation than that right there, especially for the guy I'm meeting. Like, wow, you strike or you get ejected, you're out, and bam, the game's over. That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I wanted to dive deeper into your novel, the At the Bat, the Strikeout that shamed America, because I read that it was based on the Ernest Thayer's 1888 poem, Casey at the Bat. And we've talked about that a little bit throughout this conversation, but I read that it was lost for a little bit from somewhere. And it was found in the Beverly University library. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Well, I kept trying to find the original poem. There were versions on the internet. It's in the public domain, so anybody can reprint it and do whatever with it. But I kept running across slightly different versions of it. I mean, they were pretty consistent, but there were slightly different versions. And I wanted to find. I knew from what I'd read that the first time it ever appeared was in the San Francisco Chronicle in June of 1888, and I wanted to find the original poem in the newspaper, so I knew exactly what version was the first version. Right. And I couldn't find it. And I even talked to 2 or 3 really good baseball historians who told me, yeah, that's where it was. It was in the San Francisco Chronicle, and I says, well, have you ever seen the poem? And none of them said, no, I haven't ever actually seen the poem in the newspaper. Mm-hmm. So I got on, finally I went to my public library here, and I says, I would really like to get this newspaper. And they did some searching for me. And the only place they could find this paper was at the University of California, Berkeley. So they did a library exchange. And back comes microfilm, which you probably don't know what it is. No. But it's basically just, they took they just take slides of newspapers and stuff, and you have to get this little machine mm-hmm. and look through this lens and actually read kind of slide pictures of the newspaper. They don't keep the actual print copies because right. they would just probably wear out and disappear. So back comes this microfilm, and there's only one library in this whole area that has a machine that I can read it on. And so I took it to this machine and read it. And there it was. There was the poem. And the amazing thing to me about the original poem that was in none of the other versions was that the poet, Ernest Thayer, had said Jimmy Blake in one stanza of the poem, and then he called him Johnny in another stanza of the poem. He was in such a poetry, newspaper poetry back then was used as filler when they would put all the stories in the paper, and if they wound up with a corner of white space at the bottom of the paper, they would just throw in some poem or something they would call filler. And so that's what this was. Ernest Thayer had probably written this poem just in case they ever needed it to throw into a corner somewhere, and he just banged it out, and there it was. He named Jimmy Blake, who was one of the people who were on base, who miraculously got on base so that Casey could come up to bat. Everybody knew that they would win the game if Casey could get up, mm-hmm. but he had all these low life hitters batting ahead of him, and one of them was Jimmy Blake, who was also Johnny Blake in the poem. So that was kind of the amazing thing to me, that and somebody whoever copied the poem or whoever changed the poem down the line had fixed it for him. It was Jimmy Blake in all other versions of the poem I saw.
It's interesting. That's cool how you really had to dig to be able to find the original poem, and I bet that there's so many things like out there where like historically they get changed a little bit, or some people make it into their own. But I was curious, once you read like the original poem and you were able to really understand, or obviously fully grasp the whole magnitude of this poem. I was curious, what really intrigued you to use this poem and write a novel about it?
You know, I consider myself a pretty good writer, but because I've been in newspapers, or maybe that's why I don't consider myself kind of an inventor of stories. And so I started using the poem, these famous. My first book was The Cremation of Sam McGee, and it's also based upon a poem, Robert W. Service poem, and that takes place in the Klondike Gold Rush in 1898, and that's a famous poem. And these are poems like Casey. These are poems that have stories. And so I took these poems that had kind of a basic story to them and said, I think I can take that and expand on it
Mm-hmm.
and use my writing skills using this amoeba of a story, this strikeout, this cremation of this guy in the Klondike, and use that as a story, because I had trouble kind of like just sitting there and inventing a story. But this gave me the story so that I could, the books are much more than the poem as far as story, but it gave me a launching off pad to do it.
That's interesting. And I've heard in your interview on ESPN radio that there was a survey done, and that most of the kids at that time knew this poem by heart better than they knew the Gettysburg Address. I think that's crazy.
Yeah, and they still do it. Just a generation older than me. In fact, I do a Google alerts on both the cremation of Sam McGee and Casey at the Bat and Mudville, so that I get an email from Google every time there's an article or anything that has Casey at the Bat or Mudville in it, and I'll get like every couple of weeks I'll get alerted to some article that has Casey at the Bat in it. And when I go to the article, it's always an obituary of somebody who's like in their 80s, 90s, who had the poem memorized. And I found out that back in those days, back in my father's generation, for some reason, poetry memorization was part of school curriculum.
Mhm.
Everybody memorized poems, and Casey at the Bat was one of them. A lot of them memorized, and when their lives are boiled down to like a handful of paragraphs in an obituary, it's just amazing how many times they'll say, well, at their 90th birthday, they got up and by heart recited Casey at the Bat, because they had it memorized in it, and they had it memorized as a child. And anything you memorize as a child, you still remember when you're 90.
Mhm.
And so I'm just amazed at how many obituaries I call up that have Casey at the Bat in them.
Yeah, that's really interesting how, this poem from 1888 is still being brought up now, is still known really around the world. And just for my listeners, basically the Casey at the Bat poem is basically about Casey's goes up to bat, and there's two runners on, and everybody knows that he's the best batter within the league, and everybody expects that he is going to be the one to help them win the game, and he ultimately strikes out. And I was curious, is with when you wrote the strikeout that shamed America, I was curious, how did the strikeout shame America?
In a couple of ways. One I can't give away because it would be a spoiler for the end of the book. But I made Casey kind of the character of Casey in the book is that he's kind of like a hero, but he has kind of personality issues that nobody knows about. Kind of like I imagine most celebrities are today. They kind of like I don't see how anybody can keep their head together very well and be famous. A few people seem to be able to handle it, but
Mhm.
it seems like most people who get really famous are head cases essentially. And so I made Casey kind of that way. He was a hero. In fact, I had him playing in California, and back then all Major League Baseball was on the East Coast because all travel was by train, so they couldn't go very far, but maybe to the Midwest. but I had Casey playing baseball in California, and they kept him there, keeping him from jumping to the major leagues by giving him a cut of the gate uh, as part of his contract. And therefore, he was the first player who actually got rich off the game itself. Al Spalding, who is in the book a little bit too, he got rich off of baseball, but he got it from a business end. He went into the sporting goods business after he played baseball. But I invented Casey as the first player who actually got rich off a game. He was like enormously famous, and then therefore was a little bit crazy. And so that probably plays into like the shaming of America, plus the strikeout itself. In fact, I think that's why the poem is famous. If Casey had hit a walk-off home run in the poem, we never would have heard of it. It's because he struck out. It's the twist at the end. And in fact, newspaper poetry in those days was always a happy ending. If you read the newspaper poetry, the poems always ended happily. And so this poem probably like really stood out when people read it because it didn't have a happy ending. It had that kind of surprise, he struck out ending. And then it was picked up by an actor, got famous mainly because this actor, he was kind of a no-named actor. He went out on stage one time, and it was kind of like vaudeville, and he didn't know what to do. And somebody handed him the poem, and he memorized it like backstage, like really quickly. I guess actors have that talent to memorize, and he memorized the poem, and he went out on stage, and there happened to be a baseball team in attendance. And after he recited the poem on stage, they stood up on their chairs and cheered. And so from that point on, he became famous, and he recited it 10,000 times. And in fact, it's one of the original recordings that's still out there, where this actor, DeWolf Hopper, you can still hear him recite, not the original time he recited it, but he recited it 10,000 times, and it was recorded. And so you can actually hear DeWolf Hopper recite Casey at the Bat. Plus you can hear lots of other, if you go on YouTube, you can find all kinds of people who, famous and not famous, who have recited Casey at the Bat on YouTube.
That's interesting. Well, that's a cool way for that guy to get famous, I guess. Give me a poem and put me out on stage and let me recite it and get famous. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
That's how we did it. Yeah,
that's interesting. And I was curious. So with the main premise of the poem being that Casey strikes out at the end, what was the main reason why you wanted to focus mainly your story on Walter Brewers, who's the umpire?
Yeah, well, probably because my officiating background a little bit. I knew a little bit about officiating, and so that I could kind of like narrate the story from how the umpire felt. And but actually, after I finished my first draft, I read it over, and my most boring character, I decided, was the umpire. He just wasn't that interesting compared to other characters like Nellie Bly, the reporter, and Casey. They just had bigger personalities than the umpire. And so when I wrote it the second time, I put him on the spectrum. I put the umpire on the spectrum. And so he had all these kind of quirks about not making sure one food doesn't touch another, and all these things. Plus people on the spectrum are really cut out to focus. And so I made him like really good at umpiring, because he could just kind of like focus on one thing, blank out everything, which is good umpires are good at anyway, is being able to focus when, especially if it's in your brain that you might have made a mistake. You can't be thinking about that when you're making your next call. So they have to be really good at getting rid of what they're thinking about from the last play and thinking about this play. So I think that made the umpire a lot more interesting in the book when I put him on the spectrum. Of course, they didn't know what the spectrum was in 1888, but when you read what he does, in this day and age, the reader today knows that this was somebody that was on the spectrum, even though they didn't call it that back then.
Right. I think it's cool to hear how you were able to mold him pretty much into the narrator just from after your first draft. Because most of the time when most of us read a book, we never really understand exactly how everything was able to come together and everything was able to mold, and how multiple drafts is really able to help you really figure out the best way to tell the story.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think any first draft is very good, but most first time authors, they quit because they don't get through the first draft,
Mhm.
and they don't realize, well, the first draft, nobody's going to read that except you. And so, if you're a first time author, you just need to push through and realize it's going to suck, but it's not going to get good until you finish that first draft, so you can go back and start fixing things. And if you are always trying, if you're writing and always trying to perfect, going back to your first chapter, going back here, going back there, and always trying to get it perfect and never finishing, eventually I think authors give up instead of pushing through a really crummy version of the book. And now you've got something that you can work with.
That's interesting, because I feel like so many of us, especially myself, even with this podcast, I'm a very much perfectionist, and if I can make it perfect, that'd be amazing. But it never usually turns out that way, to where it's exactly where I want it to be. But it always comes out with what I'm happy with, and so as a writer, it must be difficult for you to get over that hump of that perfectionist sort of mindset, to be a little bit more open-minded, to try and make it into something that makes you happy and that you're happy with your work.
Yeah, I think my journalism background helped me a little bit with that because I was always on deadlines there.
Mm,
And when you're on a deadline, you can't sit there and look at your lead for a long time trying to get your lead perfect while the rest of the story just sits there and the clock's ticking.
right.
You have to say, well, that lead's not very good, but I need to push through and write this whole story, and I can come back to the lead after that and try to fix it rather than spend an hour on the first paragraph trying to get that perfect. And plus the deadline, you always had to turn the story in before you thought it was where you wanted it, because otherwise you would spend a month when they needed the story by 5 o'clock that day. So, and now with the internet, I think that's even more so. They're being first is really important now, because if you're first, you get more clicks. And so there's probably even less perfectionism going on with journalism now, because they need to really get that out, because the first publication that gets kind of a big story out, they get the early clicks.
Yeah, exactly. That makes sense. And so I was curious. One last thing that I was curious about was, what was your reaction when your book really started gaining national attention?
Uh, you never, that's another thing you never know as an author. You never know if it's any good, for one thing, you read it and of course you're biased. And then the next people that read it are friends and family. And of course they can't tell you what they really think. They just love it. It's the best thing they ever read. But you really don't know if somebody that doesn't know you is going to like it. So, I had no idea if it was going to be any good. So it just feels really good that people that I don't know, don't have to say nice things about me, are leaving me really nice reviews and ratings and stuff, and voting for the book on the Goodreads site. Books. There's not a lot of great baseball fiction out there, and I'm not sure why, because a lot of good baseball fiction has become really good motion pictures. The
Mhm.
Natural and Field of Dreams, I think, was taken from Shoeless Joe and several. So a lot of good baseball fiction is successful. So I don't know why a lot of it's not been written. But that's another. I was able to get into the top 10 because it looks to me, when I look at the list, it looks like to me that there's only about 15 really good baseball fiction books ever written, and that kind of surprises me. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because it appeals to sports fiction appeals to men, and one, men don't read as much as women, and two, the men that read are more likely to read nonfiction. And so
Mhm.
maybe there's just never been a big market for sports literature. There's pretty good market for sports nonfiction,
Mhm.
but you know there's women that like to read sports and women that like to read sports fiction, but maybe not enough of them. And the men who are already a minority of readers to begin with, maybe they just don't want to read the fiction. So that's the only thing I can assume. So I tried to write the book that appealed, and all the other successful baseball books too. They appeal to a broader readership. They're about baseball. Baseball is kind of the primary subject, but they expand into a lot of other areas.
That makes sense. And it must have been something where, kind of like when you were writing it, like you said, you tried to make it work for everybody to where anybody could read it and enjoy it.
Yeah, and that's why I brought in Nellie Bly, who is a real life reporter. She's really well known because she was the first person to go around the world in 80 days. She actually made it in 72. The Jules Verne novel Around the World in 80 Days came out when it wasn't possible for anybody to circumnavigate the globe in 80 days. But by the late 1880s, railroads were up and running. Ships were faster, and they'd actually built a couple of, I don't know if they were bridges or something, but all of a sudden, everybody looked at the possibility, and it became, people looked at it as, it would be possible to go around the world in 80 days. And Nellie Bly was the first person that did it. It was like this huge, this was in the time of yellow journalism where they were basically doing a lot of like flamboyant things to get readership. It was the heyday of newspapers. Radio wasn't even invented yet. So like the average person back then read like 2 or 3 newspapers a day. So newspapers were king, and they were all pushing for circulation and street buys and that kind of thing with these like really outrageous things. So her going around the world in 80 days was one of those. She actually got famous though. Before that, she infiltrated an insane asylum.
Oh, wow.
She went out on the street and pretended she was like just nuts, and a policeman like arrested her, and she went before a judge and convinced the judge that she was crazy and got put into Blackwell's Island insane asylum in New York, and then wrote a big expose about the conditions in the insane asylum of being like really bad. And it changed not only that institution, but institutions all over the country because of what she did. So she was a very successful reporter, and so of course the whole baseball game's fiction, but I was able to figure out a way to get her at the baseball game and make it the very first baseball game she attended. She'd actually written a book about her days in the asylum. It was called 10 Days in a Madhouse. And it was a successful book. And so I had her in California pushing this book, trying to sell this book, and then being escorted to this baseball game by the son of some senator or governor, is what she said in the book. She didn't even know the son of who he was, but back then women had to be escorted to baseball games, and this was her escort. And so I put her at the game. So she actually witnessed this fictional strikeout of Casey. And that brings kind of a female character in the book, an interesting character. She's kind of like ahead of her time as far as, women weren't expected to be newspaper reporters back then, but she had to like bow to the mores of the time too, like going to a game with an escort. You could tell that, she didn't like it, and she thought her escort was pompous because he was trying to explain the game to her, and how it's kind of like man speak. You take a woman to a game and you try to tell her like everything there is to know about baseball, and
exactly.
Pretty soon they're just bored and rolling their eyes. And so she's like that when she's at this game, she's like that as well.
That's interesting. And lastly, I was just curious, Dowd, is there anything that you're working on over the next year or two that my listeners can look forward to?
I want to do one more book, but I'm trying to keep my thing with the poems, and I've kind of been looking for a good poem that tells a story. And I've thought about The Night Before Christmas, but I just can't figure out. I don't know if I want to write a Christmas book. So I've been doing a lot of thinking on how to take the poem The Night Before Christmas and write a novel that's a little more than a Christmas novel. So I haven't figured that out, but that may be where I've headed. I may be going to like Rudyard Kipling. He wrote a lot of poems. I've been reading a lot of his poems. I'm basically looking for a good poem that I can spin into another novel, but I haven't come up with one yet.
Well, I'm definitely looking forward for your next piece of work, because this one was definitely a home run. And for everybody that is listening right now, go on to Amazon, look up At the Bat, The Strikeout That Shamed America by Dell Leonard Jones, and it's definitely a great read. And every place that I looked, even other than Amazon, the reviews all said 5 stars, and even some people said, I wish I could put more. So definitely go and check that out. And Dell, I really appreciate you talking about the book today, and for taking the time.
Sure, thank you. And if you forget the name of the book, if you go to the Amazon site and just search for Strikeout, for some reason, if you search Amazon site Strikeout, the book is like the first thing that comes up. So that's kind of helpful, especially when
Exactly.
people are hearing things on, people may be driving and listening to this, so they may not remember the name of the book, but they'll remember the name Strikeout, just Strikeout.
So there you go. Look up Strikeout and you're going to be able to find it. Thank you, Dell.
Thank you.